Everyone has a game, or multiple games, that they went out on a limb one day at GameStop and bought. Whether that be because the back of the box looked cool, it was cheap enough, you had heard about it before, or if you're like me, the box art caught your eye. TimeShift is one of the games that caught my eye long ago. I remember playing it on the 360 but never finishing it, and then when I built my computer years ago, I found it on Steam, but the game would always crash when I tried to download it and play. So for the longest time, I just never did, and I thought it was broken and just unable to be played. But recently, I've been doing some digging and research, and I found that the Steam version was never given any way to update to the 1.2 version like the disc-based version was. But now, you can easily find this update and patch your game files by dragging and dropping them into the bin folder. And voila, you've got TimeShift on your PC. And if you've been dealing with the same problem I have, then I offer an easy way out. The patch link is in the description of this video right now. All you have to do is download it, and then click to replace all the files its content will replace. Then open up the game, and it should run fine. But on the back end of that, TimeShift's development is honestly one of the most interesting things about the game. I'll try to keep it kind of concise because I'm just condensing what information I find online, but it's still fascinating. And when the eventual episode of Mr. McMuscle's What Happened comes out for this game, I'll be sure to link it at this point in the video. Until then, here we go. In 2003, right off the heel of their Serious Sam-inspired adventure, Will Rock, Saber Interactive began working on an exciting take on the FPS. This endeavor caught the attention of Atari a year later, who was set to release the game on the PC and original Xbox. Now 2 years into development, the project was doing so well and looked so good for current generation. Atari saw it best to move the project to the next generation on Xbox 360. Sometimes you just gotta risk it to get the biscuit, and Atari already had the rolling pin flowered. But then, in a cruel twist of fate, Atari was having money troubles and needed a solution. So the best idea was to sell off some of their intellectual properties. Through lots of twists and turns that I feel like I'm missing, the eventual publishers wound up becoming Blizzard's parent company, Vivendi Games. Keep in mind that all these major shakeups and changes to the game's development and funding came with up to year-long delays. And just a few of these delays were sprung on Saber after the game was already set to launch. But the team was just that confident to turn the small shooter experiment into a AAA franchise. The latest of these delays, however, had come after a poorly received demo of the game, featuring a large overhaul of the game's narrative and cast. The original plan was to have you take control of a real Mary Sue character known as Colonel Michael Swift, a hardened war guy who had his daughter killed and taken away or something. And you travel to an alternate timeline using the military's new experimental time travel suit to take on Crone, a guy who has basically become a dictator. I think he may have had a time travel suit too. I don't know. There's a lot of information on this game that never was. All of this was dropped in the final game, however, for a much more tertiary story. Michael Swift was canned, and most of the serious elements were thrown out as a result of them not meshing well with everything else. And then, for the final time, the game was delayed at the top of 2007 to add new graphical improvements and a port to the PS3. Around the holiday season, TimeShift was released, and met with mixed but mostly positive reception that we'll cover in just a moment. What a crazy ride for a game that started all the way back in 2003. To go through 2 publishers, a scrap narrative, changes in scope, and adding a port to a third machine, it's a miracle this game came out at all. The magnitude and multitude of setbacks and changes would have almost spelled out the end for any other team. Plenty of games get announced and then either fade out of the public's eye for a long time or for good. And some games resurface under a completely new identity. However, TimeShift stayed the course and stuck to its original plan for the most part, even having some of the levels in the 2003 demo remain in the eventual release, relatively untouched. And again, I'm definitely missing pieces of this puzzle because I'm almost positive that that blue skeleton guy will be doing a much better job than I could later on. If it's really something that interests you, I've left some links to gameplay footage from a few of the prior builds in the description. Now, without further ado, let's get to the real miracle of this story, the fact that this game is actually really good. TimeShift sees a nameless member of a government-funded time travel project stepping up and becoming a hero in the middle of a surprise catastrophe. The one of the two suits that the government has been developing to travel through time has been stolen by this guy, Crone. And don't worry, he won't be showing up until the actual last 5 seconds of the game. And no, that's not an exaggeration. Crone has stolen the Alpha suit and used it to take over the past or something, and it's up to you to use the Beta suit and stop him or whatever. I don't know. If you remember, the main protagonist and most of the story elements were ripped out during the game's final delay. This causes the game to feel extremely scattered when its narrative comes into question. There are no recurring characters, there is no real motivation for the so-called beta suitor to continue on other than saving the day because it's what a protagonist would do. There are cutscenes that last literally 4 seconds and were supposed to be connectors to big plot moments, like the second to last level sees you in a Zeppelin flying toward Crone's HQ with the Resistance. The level ends, a 4-second cutscene plays, and you're loaded into the last level with the Zeppelin crashed and burning behind you.
To every member or supporter of the occupant uprising, this is Commander Cook.
If you're thinking about it, you're gonna have a lot of questions, but I don't think that's what you're supposed to be playing TimeShift for. Not this version, anyway. There was a lot of narrative stuff that was obviously gutted. It's not what the focus was on, thankfully. And ultimately, I think the right call was made. TimeShift is a standard first-person shooter on the surface. Everything you would expect to be here is here. But where you could imagine the game ask for a little more credit is with the time manipulation powers. You can slow down time to avoid hazards of all sorts, freeze time in its place to walk on water and ignore things like fire, even if I don't think that one makes a lot of sense, and you can reverse time to do a redo of a situation, such as driving off a cliff or getting out of the way of the thrown grenade. The time powers are a great way to have the players interact with these environments. There are some light puzzles at work here, but nothing that ever makes you feel clever. Seeing as how there are 3 variants of your chaos control, one of them is always bound to be the solution, so it's just a matter of applying it once it's been discovered. There are some interesting concepts teased, like this wind turbine where the air is so strong it sucks your fired ammunition down. You can either risk getting closer to the enemy or just freeze time and take the shot across the terminal. These scenarios are always really cool, but it's a shame that they turn out to be the exception rather than the rule. Things do get more fun when experimenting with your interactivity on the enemies. You can shoot the enemy's gun out of their hand and disarm them, and even steal their weapon if time is frozen. This will cause them to scurry around and try to find a new one, or they'll just surrender if they can't. You can freeze time and pump an enemy full of shotgun blast until the kinetic energy builds up and launches them across the room. And if your time gauge is full, it's so satisfying to walk into a room of enemies and just take them all out before they even knew you were there. The game encourages you to use the time powers very frequently, and it makes sense, but especially when you consider that your health recovers a lot faster when moving through time. But that's pretty much it. Yeah, I know it doesn't sound like much, and if I'm being real, it isn't much. But it just really is a fun system to utilize. The enemy AI is actually pretty cunning. When it decides to work, that is. They do have quite a few moments of stupidity. Okay, a lot of moments of stupidity, but they do a good job of flanking you and making you actually watch your time gauge. You'll get gunned down pretty fast if you just charge forward without taking any precautions. Again, you guys know me. I was playing on the hardest difficulty, and this was one of the few times I felt like I was actually being fairly challenged by the game's cranked difficulty. It felt fair, and I would recommend anyone to play the game on this difficulty, even if it's your first time, because for as much as I love the time abilities and they make the game worth playing, they are the one thing that breaks it in half. But sporadically. It's weird. Like I said earlier, you can walk into a room, stop time, bomb the nogs of all the enemies in the 10 seconds you're given, and London Bridge, they all fall down. But then there are other scenarios where the enemy is up on a sniper perch and they have amazing accuracy because of course they do on hard mode. Or they make you fight an enemy with some time powers of their own with a typically powerful weapon. This can cause spikes in the difficulty. Never frustrating ones, mind you, but it never quite feels like the game finds a happy balance between instant kill scenarios and buffed enemy types, or 10-second aiming challenges. And it's not just the time powers that skew the battles in your favor. The levels are filled to the brim with powerful weapons that can make short work out of any enemy, and most importantly, ammo boxes that regenerate all of the ammo in all 3 of your weapon slots. These are found a lot more frequently than you might think, thus it was very easy to find my 3 favorite weapons and constantly keep the damage coming with little to no concern of running out of ammunition. And if running out is actually becoming a concern, just freeze time and line up your shots so you don't waste any. That red reticle conveniently turns gray when the enemy is done eating lead, which eliminates guesswork for when they've had enough bullets to drink. And speaking of that lead, all of the firearms are highlights. I really haven't loved guns in a first-person shooter like this since Halo. It's a couple things. Most apparently, they all feel really distinct and good to fire off. The basic carbine feels so precise and impactful. The E.M.F cannon is a lightweight explosion distributor. The Echo rifle is a lot of fun because it's much easier to line up headshots with a laser sight. And the cream of the crop, the Firestorm, an incendiary SMG that's my favorite by a country mile. On top of the weapons all feeling great on the surface, most have a second method of fire as well. A grenade launcher for the carbine, a chargeable blast that travels in a straight line for the cannon, the rifle zooms in so I guess it doesn't really count, and a motherfucking flamethrower for my baby. I'm leaving out a few of the other weapons for the sake of brevity, but the same rules apply. There is plenty of fun firepower to take control of here. And I know this is a small thing, but it'll be important later on, so hear me out. Some of my favorite things about these guns are how they're reloaded. This is not a joke. You hit reload and the carbine just ejects its clip with a new one, replacing it and flicking its slide with one swift motion. The cannon pops the core out and the claws disengage, leaving a new one to be slotted back in and accepted by the mechanism. The rifle just kind of puts a new clip in, but with less energy than the carbine. And with the Firestorm, the bandolier is drug into the trainer with a satisfying click, while the flamethrower sees the canister so amusingly popped out for the next one to be twisted on. That one's my favorite. And it should be noted that all of these animations are accompanied by this subtle but satisfying sound design. And all of this applies to the multiplayer suite as well. As you could imagine, the multiplayer for a 2007 game probably isn't as active in the year 2021. But thankfully, I was able to gather some folks up and play a few rounds with the help of the Lost Planet Discord server. I bet you didn't see that one coming. Yeah, I was looking to see if there was a TimeShift Discord I could join, but the only one I found wasn't very active. So I asked around in the most helpful place I know to look, the good fellas in the Lost Planet Discord server. After asking around, a good bean who goes by the name of Demon27248 was able to send me an invite to his TimeShift server. And after some time, we were able to gather a few people up and play a match. Mainly myself, Demon, and the Lost Planet 2 Terminator himself, Vyr'sai. It was a very fun time. The biggest hurdle to jump over is how differently the time manipulation works here. It'd be predictably unplayable if each player was able to freeze, slow, or reverse the entirety of the map at any time. Thus, workarounds were created. You collect these batteries scattered across the map to build up your time energy. Once you have the right amount built up, you essentially throw a time grenade that spawns a small field that contains the effect you chose. Each level of your power costs a specific amount of time energy to use. Slow being the least expensive, stop being the next level, and reverse being the most energy consuming. If you get caught in one of these fields, it's not completely over. You can use a time shield to nullify any time bending effects for a short time, but you also have to be careful because the time shield uses the same time energy as your time bombs. So if you spend your time trying to trap people in time bubbles, you'll be helpless if you get trapped in one yourself. This is a brilliant way to create a risk versus reward system that every player has to be conscious of. It's also a bit of resource management. Making sure to not leave yourself helpless to time traps is difficult when throwing them out yourself. Not only can it obviously freeze and slow down the opponents, but it also does the same thing to their fire, giving you time to move out of the way. And reverse grenades can not only redirect fire, but also players themselves. If you know what to do, this can be used to fling yourself up on ledges normal jumps can't reach, adding more incentive to be conscious of your time energy's use. Is it smarter to chase down this enemy or keep my charge in case I get ambushed? And surviving long falls isn't even out of the question if you got the chops for it. And if you don't have the chops, well then the game will be sure to remind you.
You suck.
In the DLC pack Urban Reduel, there's even an achievement dedicated to surviving a long drop with the time powers, so most of these exploits were probably fully intended perks to the time fields. The small amount of maps that we did play on had a number of gimmicks to go with them to keep things interesting. The wind turbines I mentioned earlier have a map dedicated to them, some even have bounce pads and other obstacles too, but it was never anything that could drastically turn the tide of battle. If you're curious as to what a full set of matches looks like from the perspective of someone who knows what they're doing, I'll leave Demon and Vyr'sai's recordings of our sessions in the description for those who are interested. And you might be thinking to yourself, if this game is so random with its difficulty and the weapons can be abused so easily, then what makes this guy think the game is actually good? I'm glad you would ask me that, because my answer would be, the game is just fun. When you play the Phantom Pain, are you engrossed in the plot, or are you pushing Big Boss to his mechanical limits? Are you playing Doom so you can see the emotional struggle of the Doom guy? Or are you trying to string together glory kills? It's obviously not a complete game, and I'm honestly surprised it was allowed to ship with the story that it did, but that was probably the conversation that the team had internally. Like I mentioned before, the earlier builds of this game were going to lean much more on the narrative, but the choice was made to prioritize the moment-to-moment feel of their game, rather than the depth of the characters that inhabit it, which I have to say was the perfect decision. Now, with all this knowledge fresh on our brains, I want to make our own little jump through time, but not to the past or future, to an alternate timeline, where TimeShift was never released on Xbox 360. It was instead delayed and delayed to the point of hibernation, and all the while it was still in the back of everyone's minds through all the mergers and companies' name changes, until one day when TimeShift made its debut as Activision Blizzard's debut VR title to rival Half-Life Alyx. Think about that! You never really connect with the beta suitor as is, but it would be such a different story if you are the one experiencing the events as they happen. There would obviously need to be more story added to the game and some reworking, but it would just make it so much more engaging. Especially if these scenes play out as short interactable dioramas where the suit malfunctions and bounces you back to your old time in the middle of a mission, just to give the player a glimpse of how bad the world is looking, and that you are on this mission for a reason. And the main gimmick, the time manipulation, I'd buy a VR game for that alone. Just imagine it! Instead of freezing time and walking up to an enemy and pressing a button and have his gun disappear from his model and reappear on yours, you could actually just pry the gun out of his hands. And slowed time would be so much fun to master. The game already models out each individual shot fired and accounts for physics and all that jazz, so making shots travel slower and then giving them the whole Matrix feel would be incredible. The reversing of time would be a little tricky, but it's already only allowed in specific areas where you can't break the game with it, so it wouldn't have to change much. Need I say anything about the weapons? They would all translate so well to VR. You might have to go the Boneworks route and have bigger weapons be heavier and more slow to maneuver with, but this would be necessary. And now, my gushing for the reload animation hopefully makes a little more sense. A big part about VR shooting games is mastering your gun's reload requirements. And given how complicated some of TimeShift reload animations are, I would be all over a game with complex reload requirements. Especially since every weapon has 2 unique reload animations. Jeez, this is making me want my theoretical timeline to be real. God! One area that could stand to be improved by making this a more interactive experience is the exploration. TimeShift has a problem of giving you a lot of great detailed environments with some seemingly optional or hidden areas, but nothing ever being around the corner. With players actually in VR being statistically more likely to want to comb through every small filing cabinet and hole in the wall, filing cabinet and hole in the wall, filing cabinet and hole in the wall, with players actually in VR being statistically more likely to want to comb through every small filing cabinet and hole in the wall, rewards being laid out for curious players is a no-brainer. It would be smart to use the concept art and hidden content that's given to you after you clear levels to the players who are trying to explore and actually keep an eye out for those types of things. Not to mention, it might be a good idea to actually hide the infinite ammo cases a little more thoughtfully. That way, firefights don't become more mindless spray fest at every possible opportunity. However, the downsides to this are pretty obvious. VR being a costly investment is the obvious one, but a totally necessary evil in my eyes. And then the more complicated reason, if you were to make a game similar to Boneworks with constant locomotion being the only option for movement, I think it would work just fine, but that might not be the most cost-effective way to see the project through to success. Since this was our theoretical rival to Half-Life Alyx, to compete, it'd need to be as accessible as that game is. The options for different styles of movement make things a bit more complicated when thinking about how some might not be able to adapt to continuous movement, which is why it's such a tough call. Accessibility is very important when designing a VR game like this, and games in general. Making exceptions and options for disabled or troubled gamers is one of the coolest things about our industry, and it's also one of the most important. And fast-paced action games like TimeShift VR might have to take the L on these options for the sake of others. Or it could sacrifice the faster action and go for something more closely resembling Alyx, but even though I love the game as is, that's the kind of game I wish TimeShift had been able to become. And that's also one of the reasons this isn't just a typical review. If I were to tell you that I like the time travel and the guns are great, this video would have been almost pointless, but that's not to say that I think TimeShift, as we have it today, is bad or anything. I also don't wish that it were a different game, but I can't help myself when wondering about the game that could have been. With the powers and guns as finely tuned and amazingly realized as they are in TimeShift, it really does feel disappointing that everything else just kind of falls down by the wayside. The environments are varied, but there's no rewards for exploring them. The narrative definitely exists, but that's about all it does. And as far as the multiplayer goes, it's certainly interesting. The few matches I was able to play thanks to the wonderful people over at the TimeShift Discord server were pretty alright. It's a very technical arena shooter. It's going to take much more practice to get better, but it can be a great time on its own once you get it up and working. If you're interested in joining and trying to populate it more so we can have more game nights, the link to the Discord server is in the description. This game definitely isn't a waste of time to go check out. I want to say it goes for like 15 bucks on Steam, but if you can find it for less than that, or even that, definitely you and a group of friends should go in on it for the multiplayer alone. And again, I don't mean to sell the campaign short. It's cool to go through and see the early Havoc engine go to work with all the physics objects and the bullets and all that other stuff and the time-stopping powers. It's so cool, but it's not amazing. Could you tell that that part was kind of off the cusp? I know you couldn't because it was so amazing. But even after all this, it's so interesting to see what kind of game this actually became after all the iterations and delays. When I truly do think this concept could produce one of VR's finest titles, if it had just come out a little later. But anyway, I appreciate you for watching. So thanks for stopping by and have a great day.